All right, Expert Authority World, we're going to have some fun here. Got the time trial on the clock. If you're listening on audio, this is the episode where I go nuts for under 15 minutes and do the next 100 episodes of the show, the intros, the EA interviews, episode 301. Now, am I going to use that one or not? I don't know. The truth is, I already have 301 because I did a little bit extra when I broke the 300, and I looked, and guess what? I need another 100. So, I don't need the episode to be under 15 minutes, but I'm going to give myself a little test, and unless you've been a guest on the show, you have not seen my process, and I don't think I did it last time because this idea came from, really gonna roach it. This idea came from, it's been a minute, and that's why you do them in blocks of hundreds so you don't have to do them every week. I was recording a bunch of episodes, and I had a block of time, and I've been telling people for years to use block 15 time. You got 96 opportunities a day to do some epic stuff. Now, I don't know about you, but I think 15 minutes or less is a good use of taking care of the next 100 episodes. So in between interviews, I went on and I just started talking to say, hey, I'm here, I have a few minutes, yada, 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 whatever I say. And I just started recording stuff, and I don't know if I hit the timer right beforehand, but it was maybe 16, 17, 18 minutes, and I had this preamble on here and everything. But this time I go, you know what? We're going to make a specific episode. It's going to be part of the show because this is part of the show, and I'm very thankful to have this problem, first world problem, #awesome. I need to go from 300 to 400, and we're going to do it live, real time. So, Steve and Nick, on today's episode, we have Mario Ficini counting from 300 to 400. Snap! And then I color correct the lights. If you want to know what this is, go to eainterviews.com/equipment. And it's my little magic trick. So every single episode, I do this before I go live. Right now we are live, and I'm fine with that. I'm actually more comfortable. And then step 1 is the clacker board, whatever it's called. Step 2 is the, I want to call it the McGrath color chart, but they were acquired, and it's not them anymore. It's X-Rite. But just go check out eainterviews.com for equipment. That's step 2 is the point. And step 3, always have a little bit of agua. It's Spanish for liquid. It's actually Spanish for water, but I like saying what I want because it's my show, and we're going to go. What do you know? We're going to go to the show. So here we go. Thank you for getting us to 300, and here's to the next one when we get to 400. So shoot, it's running. EA Interviews, episode 301. EA Interviews, episode 302. EA Interviews, episode 303. EA Interviews, episode 304. EA Interviews, episode 305. EA Interviews, episode 306. EA Interviews, episode 307. EA Interviews, episode 308. EA Interviews, episode 309. EA Interviews, episode 310. EA Interviews, episode 311. EA Interviews, episode 312. EA Interviews, episode 313. Woo! It's a Detroit joke. EA Interviews, episode 314. EA Interviews, episode 315. EA Interviews, episode 315. EA Interviews, episode 316. EA Interviews, episode 317. EA Interviews, episode 318. EA Interviews, episode 319. EA Interviews, episode 320. EA Interviews, episode 321. EA Interviews, episode 322. EA Interviews, episode 323. EA Interviews, episode 324. EA Interviews, episode 325. EA Interviews, episode 326. EA Interviews, episode 327. EA Interviews, episode 328. EA Interviews, episode 329. EA Interviews, episode 329. EA Interviews, episode 330. EA Interviews, episode 331. EA Interviews, episode 332. EA Interviews, episode 333. EA Interviews, episode 334. EA Interviews, episode 335. EA Interviews, episode 335. It's been a whopping 2.5 minutes. Are we done yet? EA Interviews, episode 336. EA Interviews, episode 337. EA Interviews, episode 338. EA Interviews, episode 339. EA Interviews, episode 340. EA Interviews, episode 341. EA Interviews, episode 342. EA Interviews, episode 343. EA Interviews, episode 344. EA Interviews, episode 345. EA Interviews, EA Interviews, episode 346. Did I do 5? EA Interviews, episode 345. EA Interviews, episode 347. EA Interviews, episode 348. EA Interviews, episode 349. EA Interviews, episode 350. I'm going to do water. I'm going to smoke 15 minutes. EA Interviews, episode 351. EA Interviews, episode 352. EA Interviews, episode 353. EA Interviews, episode 354. EA Interviews, episode 355. EA Interviews, episode 356. EA Interviews, episode 357. EA Interviews, episode 350. Nope. EA Interviews, episode 358. EA Interviews, episode 359. EA Interviews, episode 3. No, it's a 10. EA Interviews, episode 360. EA Interviews, episode... EA Interviews, episode 361. EA Interviews, episode 362. EA Interviews, episode 363. EA Interviews, episode 364. EA Interviews, episode 365. EA Interviews, episode 366. EA Interviews, episode 367. EA Interviews, EA Interviews, episode 367. EA Interviews, episode 368. EA Interviews, episode 3... No. EA Interviews, episode 369. EA Interviews, episode 370. EA Interviews, episode 371. EA Interviews, episode 372. EA Interviews, episode 3... Wow. Come on, we're there. We're done. EA Interviews, episode 372. EA Interviews, episode 373. EA Interviews, episode 374. EA Interviews, episode 375. EA Interviews, episode 376. EA Interviews, episode 377. EA Interviews, episode 378. EA Interviews, episode 379. EA Interviews, episode Shoot. That was supposed to be cool. EA Interviews, episode 380. Home stretch. 6 minutes. Under 10. Done. EA Interviews, episode 80. Where are we? Crap. EA Interviews, episode 381. EA Interviews, episode 382. EA Interviews, episode 383. Nah. EA Interviews, episode 383. EA Interviews, episode 384. EA Interviews, episode 385. EA Interviews, episode 386. EA Interviews, episode 388. EA Interviews, episode 389. EA Interviews, episode 390. EA Interviews, episode 391. EA Interviews, episode 392. EA Interviews, episode 393. EA Interviews, episode 394. EA Interviews, episode 395. EA Interviews, episode 396. EA Interviews, episode 397. EA Interviews, episode 398. EA Interviews, episode 399. EA Interviews, episode... Shoot. EA Interviews, episode 399. EA Interviews? Nope. EA Interviews, episode 400. Oh, stop. Stop. 752. Now, I'm kind of happy. I'm kind of excited, but I'm also kind of like, I nearly cut the time in half. Now I have to beat this next time. That was pretty smooth. It was about 11 mishaps, though. Sir, that's about it. That was the whole point of this episode. Nailed it. I don't even think this episode would be 15 minutes now. So, sincerely, thank you for supporting the show, for continuing to subscribe and watch and share it with people and give feedback. And this is surreal. If you have a show, I would recommend doing this also because it's kind of fun to paint the picture and go, wow, EA Interviews. Episode 400. I just got done giving a guest interview with Josh Carey about my favorite episode, and I chose Rick Barker episode 4. And it was one of the hardest things I had to do because there are so many. But I'll never forget the first 10. And now just to say, EA Interviews episode 400. Oh, I didn't do the bonus one. I always do a bonus one. EA Interviews, episode 401. Thank you. Sincerely. Thank you. I'll see you in the next episode, and I'll see you for the next 100. All right, Expert Authority World, we have another great episode here today. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day, and God bless.